Keep your hands on the wheel where I can see them. Don't move, don't speak, and don't think that suit and that shiny car will protect you. Because right now, you fit the description of a dangerous suspect. And if you twitch the wrong way, I'll drag you out on the pavement and make you regret it." That was the first thing Officer Daniel Briggs shouted across the quiet morning air, his words slicing like glass, his tone already set to guilty before any facts were checked. Before we go further, where are you watching from? Comment below, hit subscribe, and like if you believe dignity should never be denied. Now let's step into the moment that changed everything. The moment when a man of law and honor was reduced to nothing more than a target of suspicion. It was just after 9 in the morning when Judge Malcolm Wright eased his black Lincoln Continental into a gas station off I-55 near Joliet, Illinois. He was 52 years old, a district court judge with more than 2 decades of service, known for his fairness, his patience, and his calm presence in the courtroom. He was on his way to Springfield, carrying notes for a noon meeting with the governor on justice reform. He wore a dark tailored suit, a pale blue shirt, polished black shoes, and his leather portfolio sat neatly on the passenger seat beside him, to anyone else. He looked like a professional starting his day. To Officer Briggs, he looked like trouble. Briggs rolled his cruiser in behind the Lincoln with lights flashing. Though there was no chase, no reported crime, nothing but his own suspicion, he saw a black man in an expensive car and, in his mind, that was enough. He stepped out, his boots scraping the pavement, his hand resting close to the grip of his holstered weapon. "Step away from the vehicle," he barked again, voice harder now. Malcolm turned slowly, keeping his hands visible, his voice calm. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Briggs narrowed his eyes. "This car matches the description of a getaway vehicle from a robbery this morning. Close enough. I'll need to see your ID." Malcolm nodded, reached carefully into his jacket, and produced his license and registration. "Everything is current. Officer, I'm on my way to Springfield for a meeting with the governor. You'll see my name there." Briggs barely glanced at the papers before tossing them on the hood. "We'll sort that out later. Open the trunk." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed measured. "Officer, I do not consent to a search without a warrant. I'll cooperate, but I know my rights." That answer was enough to set Briggs off. "Back of the car. Hands where I can see them." By this time, a second cruiser pulled in. Officer Megan Riley, younger, less certain, stepped out and hovered a few steps away, her posture stiff, her eyes shifting nervously. She already sensed the line being crossed but didn't know how to stop it. Malcolm complied, walking to the rear of his Lincoln, tall and composed, his hands open and visible, his movements deliberate. He stood calmly, his back straight, his head high, showing no fear, only resolve. Briggs yanked open the driver's door, leaned inside, and began rummaging through the glove box without permission. Malcolm's voice rang clear. "Officer, I do not consent to a search. You are making a serious mistake." Briggs slammed the compartment shut, turned back, and without hesitation grabbed Malcolm's arm. He twisted it behind his back, snapping on a cuff so tightly that the steel cut into skin. "That's obstruction," he barked, loud enough for everyone at the station to hear, as if declaring guilt could make it so. Riley froze, her lips parting, her eyes darting nervously. But then, under Briggs's sharp glare, she stepped forward, hesitated, and fastened the second cuff with trembling hands. Across the lot, a college student named Rachel Simmons had already pulled out her phone, recording every second. Her voice, soft but full of disbelief, could be heard on the video. "This man hasn't done anything." A few feet away, retired veteran Samuel Hayes stood beside his pickup, arms crossed, his weathered face marked with anger. "That man doesn't look like a criminal," he muttered, loud enough for some to hear. "He looks like a judge on his way to work." But Briggs ignored them. He gripped Malcolm's arm and marched him toward the cruiser, his face set with smug certainty. Malcolm did not resist, did not plead, did not shout. He walked with quiet dignity, his head high, his steps firm, even as the cuffs dug into his wrists. He knew this was bigger than a misunderstanding. He had seen this pattern too many times in the stories told by young men who never had the power to fight back. Now it was his turn to stand in that same place. As Briggs shoved him toward the back seat, Malcolm spoke once, his voice calm, steady, deliberate. "You are violating my rights, officer, and I promise you, this will not end the way you think." Briggs scoffed. Riley looked away, and Rachel's phone kept recording, the red light blinking, around them. The morning went on as if nothing had happened, cars pulling in, people filling tanks, but those who had witnessed it would never forget. A respected judge, a man who had given his life to the law, was treated like a criminal for no reason other than prejudice wrapped in authority. And as the cruiser door slammed shut, the sound echoed like the closing of a chapter and the beginning of another. Because what no one realized in that moment, not Briggs, not Riley, not even the bystanders holding their breath, was that the man they had just humiliated would be the same man sitting on the bench the very next day, presiding over their hearing, turning this gas station stop into a story that would shake the state and remind everyone that justice, though slow, has a way of finding its voice. The ride from the gas station to the precinct was silent except for the rattle of the cuffs biting into Malcolm Wright's wrists, a sound that echoed in his mind more loudly than the hum of the engine. Officer Briggs drove with a hardened jaw, satisfied with what he believed to be a righteous arrest, while Officer Riley sat stiff in the passenger seat, her eyes flicking toward the rearview mirror more than once, catching sight of Malcolm's calm expression and the quiet strength in his eyes. She could not shake the feeling that something about this arrest was wrong. Yet she said nothing, her silence making her complicit. When they pulled into the state police precinct in Springfield, Malcolm was led through the side entrance like a criminal, the cuffs still locked tight, the steel marking red lines into his skin. Officers at desks looked up as he passed, some smirking, some whispering, others barely lifting their heads. But to Malcolm it was a familiar look, the look of people too willing to judge before they knew the facts. He was sat down hard in a molded plastic chair in a holding room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. His cuffs were removed, but the sting in his wrists remained, not only on the skin, but in his spirit. He asked politely, firmly, to call his office, explaining that he had a scheduled meeting with the governor in just a few hours. But his request was brushed aside as if it were an annoyance. "You'll have your chance," Briggs said curtly, shoving paperwork toward a booking officer. Malcolm waited, the clock on the wall ticking past minutes that felt like hours, and each time he repeated his request. The answer came back the same, "Not yet," to them. He was just another middle-aged black man pulled in for suspicion, and his calmness only made them more uneasy, as though not shouting or protesting must mean he was hiding something in the corner. Riley stood back, her arms crossed loosely, her face pale. She avoided Malcolm's gaze, but her own conscience gnawed at her, because she had seen the identification tossed aside, had felt the tremor in her own hands as she fastened the cuffs, and now the reality of that choice pressed on her chest heavier than the badge on her uniform. Briggs, on the other hand, moved with arrogance, passing Malcolm's holding area more than once, pausing to glance in with a smirk as though daring him to object. "So," he said mockingly on one pass, leaning against the doorframe, "you going to tell us why you were sitting there with your engine running, casing the area, waiting for someone maybe?" His tone was not a question, but an accusation. Malcolm lifted his head, his voice calm but unyielding. "I was reviewing directions on my phone. I had a meeting in Springfield. That is all." Briggs scoffed. You people always got a story," and pushed himself away from the frame, leaving Riley frozen in place. Shame painted across her features. The hours dragged on, nearly 3 in total, with Malcolm left to sit in that hard chair, his portfolio still in his car, his dignity reduced in the eyes of those who saw only skin, not substance. He did not shout, did not argue, did not give them the anger they seemed to expect. And in that restraint he carried himself as he always had, with the discipline of a judge who had heard countless stories of injustice from defendants who never had his platform, his protection, or his voice. Memories of his older brother came back to him in fragments. The brother shot years ago in a mistaken stop. The wound that had first pushed Malcolm into law. He felt that old ache, but he also felt resolve, a clarity that this moment would not be wasted, that his silence was not weakness, but a gathering of strength. Around him, the precinct buzzed with the daily rhythm of law enforcement, radios crackling, keyboards clacking, jokes traded between officers who barely glanced his way. But occasionally one would pass, their eyes lingering just a moment longer on his tailored slacks, his polished shoes, the way he carried himself even in humiliation. Some muttered under their breath, "Thinks he's special," as though dignity itself was a crime. And then the door opened, and with it, a change. Sergeant Laura Martinez, shift commander, stepped inside. A woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes that missed little. She scanned the room. Then her gaze landed on Malcolm. "How long has he been here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the background noise. "Almost 3 hours," someone replied. "Obstruction. Vehicle match." Martinez frowned, walked closer, and asked Malcolm directly, "Sir, have you been advised of your rights?" Malcolm met her eyes, steady, respectful. "Yes, Sergeant, but I have not been permitted to call my office. I have requested 3 times. His tone made her pause, the clarity in his words unlike the usual suspects she encountered. "What's your name again?" she asked. "Malcolm Wright," he answered, and then added with quiet force, "And I strongly recommend someone check that name before this mistake grows larger." Behind her, Briggs laughed harshly. "He's been pulling that important man act since we brought him in," he sneered. Arms crossed, smug grin spreading. Martinez turned her head sharply. "That's enough. Briggs!" Her eyes cut back to Malcolm, something shifting in her face as she registered his tone, his presence, his calm authority. She walked briskly to the nearest terminal, her fingers tapping across the keys. At first she skimmed casually, but then her brows furrowed, her pace slowing, her eyes scanning line after line, academic honors, judicial appointments, certifications, photos, and then the realization struck her like a weight. Judge Malcolm L. Wright, presiding judge of the 7th District Court of Illinois. She checked the photo twice, 3 times, and each time the face on the screen matched the man sitting quietly in the holding area. She straightened, the air in the room shifting as she walked back, her steps quick, her face pale but composed. Briggs leaned lazily against the wall, still smug. Riley silent in the corner, and the booking officers watching curiously. Martinez opened the door, looked directly at Malcolm, and asked, "You said you had a meeting with the governor today?" "Yes," Malcolm replied, his voice calm as ever. "At noon." Martinez drew a breath. "Your Honor, I apologize. This should never have happened." The words froze the room. Briggs stood up straighter, confusion breaking across his face. "What do you mean?" "Your Honor," he stammered. Martinez turned on him, her voice cold, steady. "You arrested a sitting state judge without probable cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant. You denied him his right to contact counsel. Do you have any idea what this means?" The color drained from Riley's face, And for the first time, Briggs faltered, his arrogance cracking. Malcolm sat still, his expression unchanged, but inside he knew the tide had turned. The humiliation was not over, but the reckoning had begun. The silence in the holding room after Sergeant Laura Martinez spoke was heavier than any set of steel cuffs, because the title she had used was not one to be mistaken, and the way she said it carried the weight of fact. "Your Honor," she repeated, her eyes steady on Malcolm Wright. "I apologize. This never should have happened." The room seemed to tilt in that instant. Briggs, who just moments earlier had been smirking with pride at what he believed to be a textbook arrest, straightened, his mouth opening slightly as though to argue, but no words came out. Officer Riley, pale and trembling in the corner, shifted her weight uneasily, the shame she had been suppressing now rushing to the surface. The booking officer at the desk froze mid-keystroke, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as though typing another word might make him complicit in something that had just transformed from routine procedure into a disaster of national proportions. Malcolm himself did not rise, did not gloat, did not even let a smile creep across his lips. He simply looked at Martinez with the same calm dignity he had carried since the first barked command at the gas station. "Sergeant," he said evenly, "you now understand the seriousness of this mistake. I need to contact the governor's office immediately. I am expected in Springfield within the hour." Martinez nodded quickly, already reaching for her radio, issuing quiet instructions to clear the process and secure his belongings. "Yes, Your Honor. We will make arrangements," she said firmly. Her tone clipped not from disrespect, but from the urgency of the damage control now required. Briggs finally found his voice, and it came out strained, desperate. "Wait a minute. How was I supposed to know he was a judge? He didn't act like one." Martinez turned on him, her expression sharp, her voice low and cutting. "You had his identification. It was your duty to verify before escalating. Instead, you ignored procedure, escalated without cause, and humiliated a sitting judge. Do you have any idea what this will do to this department?" Briggs tried to protest, but his words stumbled out half-formed. He was at the station. Engine running. Matched the description." Martinez cut him off. "You had no probable cause, no warrant, and no respect for the rights of the man you detained. This is not just a mistake. It is misconduct." Riley shifted uneasily, finally speaking in a quiet, shaky voice. I should have checked the ID myself. I didn't. I just followed his lead." Her admission hung in the air like a confession, one that confirmed what Martinez already knew. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a violation. Malcolm sat quietly, his eyes steady, his voice calm as he spoke once more. "Sergeant, I am not interested in revenge. I am interested in accountability, and right now, accountability starts here." Martinez nodded, her respect for him deepening as she realized he was not raising his voice, not wielding his power in anger, but speaking with the same steady authority that had defined his career. She escorted him out of the holding room personally, the shift in posture among the other officers unmistakable. Where moments before they had looked on with smirks or indifference, now they watched in silence, some with shame, some with fear, all with the dawning realization that the man they had dismissed as another routine arrest was in fact a pillar of the very justice system they served. As Malcolm walked through the precinct halls, his wrists still marked red from the cuffs, conversations hushed, eyes followed, and the story began to take root beyond the walls. Rachel Simmons, the college student who had filmed the arrest, had already uploaded the 47-second clip to social media, and while Malcolm was still in the building, the first notifications had begun to appear on screens across the city. Samuel Hayes, the veteran witness, had already called a local reporter he trusted. His voice filled with outrage as he described what he had seen. By the time Malcolm stepped into the fresh air outside the precinct, the weight of humiliation was already shifting into the momentum of revelation. Sergeant Martinez walked beside him, offering him her phone so he could contact the governor's office directly. Malcolm accepted, his voice steady, professional, measured as he explained the delay, the unlawful detention, the fact that he would still arrive, but that the matter would require attention. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He simply told the truth, and the truth was more powerful than any performance could have been. Inside the precinct, Briggs was being pulled into a side office by Martinez, his protests muffled, his future already unraveling. Riley sat alone at her desk, her face pale, her hands shaking as she realized the trajectory of her career had just shifted as well. The buzz of the building had changed. Whispers spread from one desk to another, from one officer to another, until the entire floor understood that a line had been crossed, and the man who had been treated like a suspect was not only innocent, but a judge whose word carried authority over their own. Malcolm paused at the edge of the parking lot, looking back at the building not with bitterness but with a deep, quiet sadness. He knew this was not just about him. He knew that for every one of him who could sit silent and wait for the truth to surface, there were hundreds, thousands, whose stories ended differently, whose dignity never returned. He stood straighter, adjusted his suit jacket, and prepared himself for what was to come, because he understood that the events of this morning would not remain inside those walls. They would grow, spread, and demand response. Sergeant Martinez, standing beside him, spoke softly. "Your Honor, again, I'm sorry. This department will answer for what happened." Malcolm nodded once. "Thank you. Sergeant, I expect nothing less." And with that, he stepped into the waiting vehicle that would take him to Springfield, his mind already shifting from the humiliation he had endured to the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. He was not thinking of revenge, not thinking of shame. He was thinking of truth, and of how. By tomorrow, the officers who had placed cuffs on his wrists would be standing in front of him, no longer as enforcers of the law, but as men and women subject to it. By the time Judge Malcolm Wright left the precinct and was driven toward Springfield, the video of his arrest was no longer just a shaky clip on a college student's phone. It had already become fuel for a firestorm that spread faster than anyone inside that building could have imagined. Rachel Simmons, trembling as she uploaded the 47-second recording, had no idea her post would explode across TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook within hours. But the moment her caption appeared, "Man in a suit arrested at gas station for nothing but existing," the clip caught like dry grass in summer heat. It showed everything in brutal simplicity. Malcolm standing calmly by his car, Briggs twisting his arm, Riley fastening the second cuff, the clear voice of Malcolm saying, "You are violating my rights," and the gasps of bystanders as the officers shoved him into the back of the cruiser, the sound of Samuel Hayes muttering, "That man looks like a judge on his way to work," added a haunting authenticity. A voice of common sense drowned out by arrogance. Within 3 hours, the video had crossed 1 million views. By the time Malcolm walked into the Capitol building in Springfield, it had tripled, and hashtags like "Justice for Right," "Rest Stop Profiling," and "Dignity Denied" were trending nationally. Newsrooms scrambled to verify the identity of the man in the video, and when confirmation came that the calm figure in handcuffs was indeed Judge Malcolm L. Wright of the 7th District Court, outrage turned into a tidal wave. Local anchors broke into regular programming, their voices filled with disbelief as they played the clip again and again, while national outlets picked it up with headlines that cut deep: "Sitting judge arrested without cause," "Justice in handcuffs," "Law turned upside down." Civil rights leaders issued statements before the sun set, some calling for the immediate suspension of the officers involved, others demanding a sweeping investigation into systemic bias in the state police. Outside the Jackson precinct where Malcolm had been held, protesters gathered with hand-painted signs that read, "Dignity in cuffs. No one is safe and judged before justice." By midnight, the crowd had grown to several hundred, candles flickering in the night, chants rising in rhythm, voices calling not just for Malcolm but for every person who had been stopped, searched, and silenced without cause. Inside the governor's mansion, Anthony Reed watched the footage with his advisors, his face drawn tight, his political instincts telling him that this was no longer a story to be managed, but a crisis to be confronted. He had planned a quiet roundtable on policy, but now he faced a roaring fire of public anger that threatened to consume not just a department, but his administration's credibility. "We have to act fast," his chief of staff said. "This isn't going away." And indeed, it wasn't. Overnight, the video reached more than 5 million views, shared not just by activists, but by everyday citizens who saw in Malcolm's calm humiliation a mirror of something deeper, a truth that had lived in silence for too long. Talk radio hosts debated furiously, some defending the police, others furious at the blatant abuse of power. One older caller summed up the mood of many when he said, "If a judge can be treated like that, what chance does the rest of us have?" That question lingered in the air, on screens, in living rooms, in offices, in churches and barber shops, everywhere people gathered. The firestorm was no longer about one man, but about what he represented, Malcolm himself, though shielded from the noise as he prepared his remarks for the roundtable, understood the weight pressing down. He had seen the clip himself on a staffer's phone, and the sight of his own calm face, his wrists bound in steel, his words ignored, struck him harder than the cuffs ever had. He knew the image would last longer than the sting, that it would be replayed long after the bruises faded. But he also knew it carried an opportunity, not for vengeance but for reform, not for shouting but for change. Meanwhile, at the precinct, the mood had shifted from arrogance to panic. Copies of the video circulated through every desktop, every officer forced to confront the reality of what had happened just hours earlier. No one laughed now. Briggs was pulled into a closed-door meeting, his protests growing weaker with every passing minute. While Riley sat at her desk, pale and silent, her hands folded as if in prayer. Sergeant Martinez fielded call after call from internal affairs, from the Attorney General's office, from reporters demanding comment. She answered with clipped professionalism, but inside she felt the weight of a storm larger than anything she had seen in her career. For once, the system was not looking outward at the public, it was staring inward at itself, and the reflection was ugly. By morning, the clip had surpassed 10 million views, and Malcolm's name was on every headline. Cars honked in support as protesters blocked intersections in downtown Chicago. College students held teach-ins, and church leaders organized vigils. Civil rights attorneys announced lawsuits, and community groups demanded accountability. Politicians who had once remained silent now spoke loudly, aligning themselves with the rising tide. The governor's office issued a short but sharp statement promising a full review. But even that was not enough. Pressure mounted for immediate action, for visible accountability, for a response that matched the outrage, and in the middle of it all, Malcolm prepared himself not as a victim but as a judge, not as a man humiliated, but as a man entrusted with responsibility. The firestorm was raging, the voices were rising, and the eyes of the nation were turning toward Springfield, waiting to see if justice could emerge not from anger but from truth. The marble rotunda of the Illinois state capitol had never felt so heavy, the air thick with expectation as reporters crowded the hallways. their cameras and microphones pointed toward the oak doors of room 312, where an emergency hearing unlike any in recent memory was about to begin. The story had spread too far, too fast. For delay, the governor, under immense pressure, authorized an immediate review of the misconduct. And at the center of it all sat Judge Malcolm Wright, the very man who had been handcuffed and humiliated less than 24 hours earlier. The chamber was packed, aides whispering nervously, media lining the walls, a few community leaders and civil rights advocates seated in the gallery when Malcolm entered, wearing the same suit he had been arrested in, his portfolio in hand. The room hushed to silence, not out of protocol, but out of respect. He took his place at the center of a three-judge panel, flanked by two colleagues brought in for balance, and across from him sat the state attorney's representative, papers stacked high, evidence files ready. At the far end of the room, the door opened again, and in walked Officers Briggs and Riley, their uniforms pressed but their faces drawn tight, their swagger gone. Briggs's jaw was clenched, his eyes darting to the floor as if avoiding the cameras, while Riley looked pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. They sat stiffly, side by side, facing the very man whose rights they had trampled, a reversal so sharp it left the room breathless. Malcolm adjusted his glasses, tapped the gavel lightly, and spoke, his voice calm but firm, carrying the authority of 2 decades on the bench. This is not a trial. This is a review of conduct to determine whether the actions taken on September 12th violated legal standards and basic human decency. We are not here to relive embarrassment. We are here to examine facts. His words cut through the tension. Not loud, not angry, but steady, controlled, filled with gravity. The state attorney began, presenting the evidence, the viral video first, projected on a large screen for all to see. The chamber filled with the sound of Briggs's harsh voice. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The image of Malcolm standing calm and composed. The moment Briggs twisted his arm. The sound of Rachel Simmons whispering, "This man hasn't done a thing." And the gasps from bystanders as the cuffs snapped shut. The video played in silence. No commentary needed. The truth plain before every set of eyes. Then came the body cam footage, which contradicted the written reports filed by Briggs. His paperwork claimed Malcolm had been verbally aggressive and resisted commands. But the footage showed the opposite. A man cooperating, calm, polite, never raising his voice, simply refusing an unlawful search. Riley's body cam caught her own hesitation. Her trembling hands as she cuffed Malcolm, her silence as Briggs declared obstruction where none existed. When asked to explain the discrepancy, Briggs shifted in his seat, his voice defensive, but the cracks showed immediately. I believed he fit the description. He refused to comply with a lawful order. I made the call based on my training." The attorney pressed him, pointing to the ID he had tossed aside without verifying. The lack of any actual robbery report matching the vehicle, the absence of probable cause. Briggs's voice grew louder, less controlled. "I was protecting public safety. He didn't act like a judge. He acted suspicious." The words hung heavy in the chamber, a naked admission of bias. Malcolm did not flinch, did not respond. He simply noted the words, his face calm, his eyes steady. Riley was questioned next, her voice soft, halting. I followed protocol as I understood it. I should have checked his identification myself. I didn't. I deferred to my partner. I regret that." Tears welled in her eyes as she continued. "When he said his rights were being violated, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't speak up." Her admission, raw and trembling, carried a weight Briggs's bluster could not. Witness testimony followed. Rachel Simmons, the college student, who spoke about her fear as she recorded, her disbelief at what she saw. Samuel Hayes, the veteran, who told the chamber in his gravelly voice, "I've served this country. I've seen men who were dangerous, and that man wasn't one of them. He stood like a judge, even in handcuffs." Each voice added a layer, building the undeniable truth that what had happened was not a mistake but a failure of judgment, a breach of trust. Throughout it all, Malcolm presided with restraint, never once raising his tone, never once showing anger, his demeanor a mirror of the dignity denied to him the day before. When all testimony had been given, when the evidence lay bare before them, he leaned forward, his voice quiet but carrying through the chamber. "We have heard the facts. We have seen the evidence. The question is not whether a mistake was made, but whether rights were violated, whether power was abused, and whether this department will hold itself accountable." The panel deliberated briefly, the outcome clear. Returning to the bench, Malcolm read the decision. Officers Daniel Briggs and Megan Riley are found to have acted without probable cause, to have escalated without justification, and to have violated the rights of the individual they detained. We recommend suspension without pay, pending full investigation by the Attorney General's office. His words landed like a gavel strike, final and heavy. Briggs sat rigid, his face pale now, his earlier bravado shattered, his eyes fixed on the table before him. Riley bowed her head, tears slipping down her cheeks, her acknowledgement of the truth plain. The chamber was silent. No applause, no outburst, only the weight of accountability settling into the air. Cameras outside the chamber caught every second of the officer's exit. Protesters waiting beyond the Capitol steps, parting in silence as Briggs and Riley were escorted out. Heads down, stripped not of their uniforms, but of their unchecked authority. Malcolm closed the session with a final remark. Justice is not about revenge, it is about responsibility. Today, responsibility has been demanded. Tomorrow, it must be sustained. And with that, he rose, his presence filling the room, not as a victim, not as a man humiliated, but as a judge who had turned humiliation into truth, and truth into the first step toward reform. The echoes of the gavel in the emergency hearing had barely faded when the corridors of the Illinois State Capitol filled with a different kind of sound. The urgent shuffle of aides, the clipped tones of phone calls, the low hum of reporters dictating breaking news into their microphones. The ruling was clear. Suspension without pay for both officers pending a full investigation, but the demand for deeper accountability pressed in from every corner of the state and beyond. Governor Anthony Reed, realizing the moment could not be managed with press releases alone, stepped to the podium later that evening with Judge Malcolm Wright standing quietly at his side. Cameras flashed in a frenzy. The marble hall behind them bathed in light, and the room settled into an expectant silence. "Today," the governor began, his voice solemn, "was not about politics. It was about responsibility. What happened yesterday to Judge Wright should never happen to any citizen, regardless of title or position. It revealed weaknesses in our system, and those weaknesses will be confronted." He laid out sweeping measures, his words rolling out like hammer blows against the stone of complacency. First, a mandatory statewide training program for every law enforcement officer in Illinois, focused on de-escalation, bias recognition, and the protection of constitutional rights. $50 million would be allocated immediately, funded through a combination of state resources and federal grants. Second, the creation of an independent oversight board, comprised of legal experts, community leaders, and former officers of high standing, empowered to investigate complaints against law enforcement across every county, free from departmental influence. Third, a review of the past 3 years of arrests and stops conducted by officers Briggs and Riley, to determine if patterns of misconduct existed, with the possibility of reopening cases where rights may have been violated. The governor's voice grew sharper as he spoke, This is not symbolic. This is structural. This is not a gesture. This is policy. And it begins now. As his words carried through the chamber, Malcolm stood beside him, his hands folded, his expression steady. He did not smile. He did not revel in vindication. He understood the cameras wanted a show of triumph, but what he offered instead was a show of gravity. When the governor finished, the press clamored with questions, and Malcolm was invited to the microphone. He stepped forward, adjusted the stand slightly, and let his calm voice fill the hall. What happened to me happens every day to men and women who do not have a title behind their name or a camera to record the truth. My story went viral, but many stories do not. This is not about one judge. This is about trust. Trust between law enforcement and the people they serve. Trust that cannot exist without accountability. Dignity cannot be optional. It must be the standard. His words struck deeper than the governor's announcements, because they came from a man who had lived the humiliation and carried himself without bitterness. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras leaned in, but Malcolm did not raise his voice, did not seek headlines. He spoke plainly, and in that plainness was power. Outside the Capitol, protesters listened on large screens, their chants quieting as his words reached them. Some wiped tears, others lifted candles higher, their voices blending into a chant that spread across the plaza. Dignity now, dignity always. Inside the precinct where the arrest had taken place, the mood was unrecognizable from the arrogance of the day before. Briggs sat in a closed office, his badge and sidearm removed, his career unraveling under the weight of his choices. He muttered excuses, claimed he was following training, but even his colleagues no longer looked at him with support. Riley, suspended alongside him, sat at home in silence, her body aching with guilt, her mind replaying the moment she snapped the cuffs onto Malcolm's wrists, wishing she had found her voice sooner. Sergeant Martinez, meanwhile, found herself thrust into the spotlight, her decision to verify Malcolm's identity seen as the turning point that prevented a wrongful arrest from spiraling into something worse. She took no pride in it. She knew she had simply done her job, the job others had neglected, in the days that followed. The reforms announced by the governor began to take shape. The $50 million for training programs was allocated swiftly, and curriculum developers worked alongside civil rights attorneys to design sessions that forced officers to confront their biases head-on. The Independent Oversight Board was sworn in within a month, its diverse panel meeting publicly, its authority to subpoena records making headlines as the first true attempt to place law enforcement accountability outside the walls of law enforcement itself. Community organizations, long ignored, were invited to testify, to tell stories that had been buried for years. Each step taken was met with both praise and resistance, but the momentum of the viral video, the image of a judge in handcuffs, proved too powerful for backpedaling. Malcolm returned to his courtroom, never once mentioning the incident from the bench. But those who entered his courtroom now did so with a new awareness. They looked at him not only as a judge, but as a man who had lived what so many of them feared. A man who had endured it with dignity. A man who had turned humiliation into reform. His restraint became a lesson of its own. A reminder that justice does not need volume to be strong. The firestorm that had begun at a gas station had burned its way into the heart of the state, and the ashes it left behind were being used to build something sturdier. Briggs prepared to fight for his career through the union. Riley considered resignation. The department braced for a wave of lawsuits, but the larger story had moved beyond them. The larger story was about a system forced to look at itself in the mirror, and about one man who stood calm and unbroken while the world decided what it believed. Judge Malcolm Wright did not see himself as a hero, but as a servant of the law, and in that role, he carried the weight of reform with the same steady dignity that had carried him through the sting of handcuffs and as Illinois began its long process of change. The nation watched closely, wondering if this moment would fade like so many others, or if, this time, dignity would finally become the standard that Malcolm demanded. 3 months after the day that changed his life and rattled a state. Judge Malcolm Wright stood on the broad stone steps of the Illinois Law Enforcement Training Academy. The autumn sun stretching long golden beams across the field where 125 recruits stood in crisp uniforms, eyes forward, shoulders squared, waiting to receive their final address before graduation. The academy had changed in those 3 months. What once had been a standard police training center was now the testing ground for the governor's reforms, the place where de-escalation, bias recognition, and respect for constitutional rights were not electives, but core requirements, drilled into the fabric of the program. The flags above the academy entrance snapped in the breeze, but the silence of the crowd was unbroken, because everyone knew who was about to speak, and everyone knew why his voice carried more weight than any manual or lecture. Malcolm stepped up to the podium slowly, deliberately, his dark suit sharp against the pale stone, his leather portfolio held in one hand, the same portfolio he had carried on the day of his arrest. Now a symbol not of humiliation, but of resilience. He adjusted the microphone, scanned the rows of young men and women before him, and began with the same calm, steady voice that had carried him through the humiliation at the gas station, through the hours in the precinct, through the storm of the emergency hearing. 3 months ago, he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, I sat on the other side of a badge. I was not treated as a judge. I was not treated as a father, a husband, or a citizen. I was treated as a threat based on nothing more than a glance and a guess. That experience could have left me bitter, but instead it left me more committed. Committed not to punishment, but to purpose. The recruits leaned in, their eyes wide, the weight of his words heavy on their young shoulders. You are not here simply to enforce laws, Malcolm continued. You are here to protect dignity. Every stop, every interaction, every word you speak to another human being is a moment where trust can be built or broken. Dignity must not be an afterthought, it must be the first thought. His tone sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity. When you put on that uniform, you carry authority, but authority without respect is nothing but force. Authority with respect, authority guided by humility and restraint, that is justice. He paused, letting the words sink in, scanning the rows of recruits, noticing the nervous swallow of one young man, the steady nod of a young woman in the second row, the way a few others shifted as though suddenly aware of the burden they were about to shoulder. I do not expect you to be perfect, he said softly, but I expect you to be accountable. I expect you to look a person in the eye and see not a stereotype, not a profile, not a statistic, but someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's parent, someone who matters. The silence was thick, almost reverent, as the recruits absorbed the gravity of the moment. Malcolm leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping slightly. 3 months ago, I told an officer who had just cuffed me, "You are violating my rights, and this will not end the way you think." I was right. Not because I held power, but because truth has a way of surfacing. And now, it is your turn to decide what kind of truth will follow you in your careers. Will your truth be the kind whispered in shame, or the kind spoken in respect? He straightened again, letting the question hang in the air, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. Go and serve with honor. Make accountability your shield, and dignity your compass. If you do that, you will not only protect the law, you will protect the people who trust you to wield it. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, quietly, the recruits raised their hands to their foreheads in a salute, not out of command but out of respect, and the image of Malcolm standing there, framed by flags and sunlight, imprinted itself on every camera, every mind, every heart that witnessed it. As the ceremony ended, families rushed forward, cadets embraced loved ones, laughter mixed with tears. But Malcolm remained on the steps for a while longer, watching them scatter, watching them begin the careers that would test everything he had just said. A young black recruit broke away from the crowd, approached him, and said simply, "Thank you, sir. I won't forget." Malcolm gave a small nod, his voice low but firm. "Then go prove it." The recruit returned to his group, and Malcolm finally descended the steps, his portfolio under his arm, his stride steady. The protests had quieted, the headlines had shifted, but the reforms remained. The oversight board was in place, the training programs were funded, and the people of Illinois carried with them the memory of a judge in handcuffs who chose restraint over rage, dignity over despair. Change would not come overnight. There would be setbacks, resistance, old habits to break. But something had shifted. A foundation had been laid, not built on fear, not built on force, but built on fairness. And as Malcolm walked to his waiting car, the autumn wind brushing his face, he allowed himself for the first time in months to breathe deeply, to feel that maybe, just maybe, the humiliation he had endured had not been in vain, because from it had come a new beginning, one he hoped would last long after his voice was gone. Justice, he knew, was not carved in stone above a courthouse door. Justice was carried in the choices of ordinary people every day, choices made quietly, without cameras, without headlines, choices that defined whether dignity was denied or defended. And in that quiet truth, Judge Malcolm Wright found peace, not as a victim, not even as a hero, but as a builder of a new foundation. Thank you for watching. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a like so more people can hear these powerful stories.